This is a personal testimony according to the life of Richard Black. Richard Black lived an ideal life in the quiet, picturesque suburbs of Dallas, Texas. His home was a charming two-story house, surrounded by a well-kept garden. This serene setting was a stark contrast to the bustling city, offering a peaceful retreat where Richard could unwind after his long days. A successful architect by profession, Richard took pride in designing homes that mirrored the tranquility he found in his own. The neighborhood was equally calm, a close-knit community where everyone knew each other by name. Richard's evenings were often spent with his beloved wife, Linda, a talented painter who shared his passion for creating beautiful spaces. Their bond was strong, nurtured by a mutual appreciation for the arts and a shared vision for their future. They enjoyed a simple yet fulfilling life. Every weekend they would stroll hand in hand through the peaceful neighborhood, exchanging pleasantries with their friendly neighbors and basking in the warmth of their community. The Blacks' home was their sanctuary, filled with laughter and love. It was a place where they both found solace and inspiration. Their life took an unexpected turn on a rainy Saturday night. The weather was gloomy, with heavy rain pattering against the windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and coziness inside their home. Richard and Linda decided to stay in and look for some old board games to pass the time. As they rummaged through the attic, they stumbled upon an old dusty Ouija board that Richard purchased years ago and had forgot about it. Linda, always intrigued by the mysterious and the unknown, suggested they try it out. Richard was skeptical at first. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, dismissing such things as mere superstitions. However, Linda's excitement was infectious. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and Richard couldn't help but be drawn into her enthusiasm. They carried the board downstairs and set it on the living room table. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anticipation and unease as they dimmed the lights and placed their fingers on the planchette. Linda asked the first question, her voice filled with playful curiosity. "Is anyone there?" she inquired, expecting nothing more than silence in response. To their amazement, the planchette began to move. Slowly at first, then with more certainty, it spelled out, "Yes." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine, but he tried to dismiss it as his imagination. Linda, however, was fascinated. She continued to ask questions, and the planchette responded, each answer adding to the growing tension in the room. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The air felt heavier, and an unexplainable chill settled over them. Despite his initial skepticism, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Linda's excitement turned to unease as the board continued to spell out cryptic messages. They decided to put the game away, but the sense of unease lingered, leaving them both feeling unsettled. Little did they know, this seemingly innocent game had opened a door to something far more sinister. The peaceful life they had known was about to be disrupted in ways they could never have imagined. The Ouija board, now relegated to a dusty corner, had set in motion a chain of events that would lead them down a dark and terrifying path. Their lives, once filled with love and laughter, would soon be consumed by fear and uncertainty. That night, Richard experienced his first nightmare. He dreamt of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching him intently. The figure's eyes glowed a menacing red, a sight that left Richard paralyzed with fear. When he woke up in a cold sweat, Linda tried to calm him down, assuring him it was just a dream. But Richard couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that lingered, a sense of impending doom that seemed to seep into his waking life. As the nights wore on, the nightmares grew more frequent and vivid. The shadowy figure became a constant presence, always lurking, always watching. Richard began to dread going to bed, knowing that sleep would bring him face to face with the terror that awaited him. He found himself waking up multiple times each night, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. The lack of restful sleep took a toll on him, both physically and mentally, leaving him exhausted and on edge. Linda noticed the changes in Richard. He became distant and irritable, a far cry from the loving husband she knew. She tried to talk to him, to understand what was happening, but Richard found it difficult to articulate the depth of his fear. The nightmares felt too real, too intense to be mere figments of his imagination. He didn't want to burden Linda with his growing paranoia, but the strain was evident in their interactions. The once cozy home that had been their sanctuary now felt oppressive and claustrophobic. Richard's sense of security was eroding, replaced by an unexplainable dread that followed him throughout the day. He began to see the shadowy figure in the corners of his vision, a fleeting presence that disappeared the moment he turned to look. The line between dreams and reality blurred, leaving Richard questioning his sanity. The peaceful life they had built was unraveling, and Richard felt powerless to stop it. Richard's encounters with the shadowy figure were no longer confined to his nightmares. It began to appear in the corners of rooms, a dark silhouette that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. At first, it was only glimpses, a fleeting shadow in the hallway, or a dark shape in the corner of his eye. But soon, the figure became bolder, its presence more pronounced and terrifying. Richard could feel its eyes on him, a sensation that left his skin crawling with unease. One night, as Richard lay in bed trying to fall asleep, he felt a cold breath on his neck. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. His heart raced, and he could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. The shadowy figure had become more than just a figment of his nightmares. It was a tangible presence that invaded the sanctity of his home. Linda, too, began to feel the effects of the unsettling atmosphere. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, sensing that something was amiss. Linda tried to remain optimistic, suggesting that they might be stressed and overworked. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had been unleashed. The couple's once vibrant and loving relationship was strained under the weight of the fear that now pervaded their home. Richard's increasing paranoia only added to Linda's concern. He would check the locks multiple times before bed, muttering about the shadowy figure and its relentless pursuit. The figure's presence was not just psychological. It began to manifest physically. Richard would wake up to find scratch marks on his arms, as if he had been clawed at during the night. Objects in the house started to move on their own, and cold spots would appear in random locations, sending shivers down their spines. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on both of them, turning their once idyllic home into a place of torment and fear. Richard's work began to suffer as he struggled to cope with the haunting. He found it hard to concentrate, his mind constantly drifting back to the shadowy figure and the sense of dread that accompanied it. His clients noticed his distracted demeanor, and his architectural projects began to fall behind schedule. The life he had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and Richard felt helpless to stop it. The shadowy figure had taken control, and Richard didn't know how to fight back. As the haunting intensified, the tension within the Black household grew unbearable. Richard and Linda, once so deeply connected, found themselves drifting apart. Their conversations were strained, punctuated by long silences and unspoken fears. The love and laughter that once filled their home were replaced by a pervasive sense of dread and frustration. Linda's concern for Richard grew, but her attempts to reach out to him were often met with anger and defensiveness. The strange occurrences in their home became more frequent and more violent. Doors would slam shut without warning, and the lights flickered ominously. Richard began to hear whispers in the walls, unintelligible and eerie, like voices from another realm. He would spend hours searching for the source of the whispers, only to come up empty-handed. His obsession with the haunting consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. Linda, too, was affected by the constant disturbances. She found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her art, her once vibrant creativity stifled by the oppressive atmosphere. One evening, as Richard worked late in his study, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, expecting to see Linda, but there was no one there. Panic-stricken, he rushed to find her, only to see her staring blankly at the Ouija board, which had mysteriously reappeared on their dining table. Linda's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered that the board had moved on its own. Richard's heart sank. He knew that the board was the source of their torment, but he felt powerless to rid themselves of it. The strain on their relationship reached a breaking point. Linda could no longer handle the constant fear and tension. The haunting had taken a toll on her mental and emotional well-being. She blamed Richard for bringing the Ouija board into their lives and for the horrors that followed. One morning, after another sleepless night, Linda packed her bags and left. Richard pleaded with her to stay, promising to find a way to end the haunting, but she was resolute. She needed to escape the nightmare their home had become. As Linda drove away, Richard stood on the porch, watching the life they had built together crumble to dust. The once vibrant home was now a shell, filled with memories of love and laughter overshadowed by fear and despair. Richard was left alone to face the darkness that had consumed their lives. The haunting was far from over, and Richard knew that he would have to confront the entity that had taken everything from him. The battle for his home, his sanity, and his soul had only just begun. The house was no longer a home but a battleground. After Linda left, the haunting phenomena escalated to a terrifying level. Richard was now alone, facing the malevolent force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The shadows in the house grew darker, and the chilling whispers turned into loud, disembodied voices. The once familiar sounds of the home, the hum of the refrigerator or the creak of floorboards, were now replaced by sinister noises that echoed through the empty halls. Richard would hear footsteps following him wherever he went. The steps were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. He began to feel a constant heavy presence, as if someone was standing right behind him, breathing down his neck. Sleep was no longer an escape. It was a battlefield. The nightmares intensified, with the shadowy figure now speaking to him, its voice a guttural whisper that promised pain and suffering. Each dream left Richard more drained and terrified than before. One evening, as Richard was trying to work on a design project, he heard a loud crash from the kitchen. When he went to investigate, he found all the cabinet doors open, the contents scattered across the floor. Glasses were shattered, and dishes were broken. The air was thick with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. Richard knew he couldn't stay in the house, but he had nowhere else to go. His life was entwined with this place, and abandoning it felt like admitting defeat. Desperation began to cloud Richard's judgment. He became increasingly erratic, jumping at every sound and shadow. His once meticulous appearance deteriorated. He was unshaven, his clothes wrinkled and stained. The energy that once fueled his creativity was now consumed by fear and paranoia. Richard tried to keep up appearances at work, but his colleagues noticed the changes. His dedication to his projects wavered, deadlines slipped, and his professional reputation started to crumble, just like his personal life. In his desperation, Richard turned to experts in the paranormal. He reached out to ghost hunters, mediums, and clergymen, hoping someone could provide a solution. Each visit brought a glimmer of hope, but none offered a lasting resolution. The ghost hunters set up equipment, capturing eerie footage and unsettling EVP recordings, but their findings only confirmed what Richard already knew. His house was deeply haunted. The mediums who visited spoke of a powerful, malevolent spirit. They performed cleansing rituals, burning sage and reciting incantations, but the sense of dread persisted. Richard watched as they moved through his home, their expressions growing more concerned with each room they entered. They claimed to feel the presence of a tormented soul, bound to the house by a dark history. Despite their efforts, the activity continued unabated, leaving Richard more hopeless than before. In a final attempt, Richard sought help from a local priest. The priest blessed the house, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers of protection. For a brief moment, the atmosphere seemed to lighten, but it was short-lived. That night, the haunting returned with a vengeance. Richard was awakened by the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. He rushed downstairs to find his living room in disarray, the sofa overturned, and the coffee table split in half. The priest returned, offering Richard advice on strengthening his faith and resilience, but the spiritual battle was taking its toll. Richard's isolation deepened, and he found it harder to distinguish between reality and the paranormal. Each attempt to rid his home of the haunting only seemed to provoke the entity further, escalating the terror and chaos. Richard ran out of options and hope, and finally moved out of the house that he so loved. Richard tells this story to make sure everyone stays away from those boards because his life was ruined and forever changed for the worst. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And do you have a true story? Tell us about it in the comments.